Have you ever noticed what happens when someone realizes they can't control you anymore, when their manipulation stops working, when you stop playing small to keep the peace, when you finally find your voice and start using it? Watch closely. That's the moment the game changes, because for some people, your growth is not inspiring, it's threatening. Your boundaries don't just protect you, they expose the ways they've been crossing lines for years. And when that old grip they had on you starts to slip, they don't always let go. No, they pivot, and what they use next is often something more subtle, more toxic, and more confusing than anything they've done before. This speech is not about blame, it's about truth. It's about understanding the shift that happens when someone can no longer manipulate you, and the dirty tricks they pull instead. We're going to talk about the masks people wear when control is no longer an option. About the guilt trips, the silence, the shaming, the gaslighting, and the quiet effort to isolate you from your own clarity. Because once you can see it, you can name it. And once you can name it, you can stop it from sinking its roots any deeper into your life. When people realize they can't manipulate you, it often triggers something deeper in them, not just frustration or disappointment, but a sense of threat. That might sound dramatic, but for many who are used to controlling others through emotional leverage, your refusal to play their game is more than a personal boundary. It feels like rejection. It feels like exposure. And this is where things get complicated. Manipulation depends on access, emotional access, access to yourself, doubt, your fear of disappointing others, your desire to belong, or your need to be seen as good or agreeable. It thrives when you're unsure about your worth, or when you've been conditioned to prioritize others' comfort over your own truth. So when someone tries to manipulate you, whether through guilt, flattery, passive aggression, or pressure, and it doesn't work, they're forced to reckon with something uncomfortable. You're not available for their version of the story. Setting boundaries becomes the first clear signal that you're no longer willing to be shaped by their approval or disapproval, and that alone is deeply unsettling to those who rely on control as a form of security. Boundaries are not walls, but they do mark the edge of where you end and someone else begins. They're not punishments, they're definitions, and manipulation cannot thrive in a relationship that has healthy definitions. When you're no longer easily guilted into saying yes, or coaxed into silence, or flattered into compliance, the manipulative person is left without their usual tools. This is where the shift often happens. If they can't manipulate you, they start to question your character instead of your choices. They'll label your boundary as selfishness. They'll call your clarity coldness. They'll say you've changed, as though growing into your own values is something shameful. And all of this is an attempt to regain what they lost, not a real connection, but control. They don't miss who you are. They miss who you were when they could easily influence you. This moment is critical. Because the temptation to explain yourself, to overjustify your boundary, to prove you're still kind and good is strong. But what's really happening is that you're being tested, not by them, but by your own willingness to trust yourself, to trust your no, to stand in the discomfort of disappointing someone without abandoning your truth. Manipulation loses its power the moment you stop needing others to be okay with your choices in order for you to be okay. When manipulation fails, it often reveals the truth about the relationship. Maybe it was never built on mutual respect. Maybe it was always transactional. Maybe you were valued not for your whole self, but for your compliance, your caretaking, your silence. That realization can hurt, but it can also be freeing, because it shows you what's real and what's not, who sees you and who only sees what you give them. And from that place, you can begin to make choices not out of fear, but out of clarity. It's important to remember that your boundary isn't the problem. Your growth isn't the threat. Their discomfort isn't your responsibility to manage. It's not cruel to protect your peace. It's not harsh to expect honesty. And it's not unkind to refuse to participate in a dynamic that leaves you feeling small, guilty, or drained. That doesn't make you hard to love. It makes you honest. And emotional honesty has always made people uncomfortable, especially those who benefit from your silence. People who cannot manipulate you often struggle to respect you. That doesn't mean you did something wrong. It means you're no longer willing to do what's wrong for you just to keep someone else feeling powerful. That's not defiance, it's dignity. And that kind of self-worth isn't loud, but it is unshakable. It's not about control, it's about alignment. And once you learn to live in alignment with your values, no one else's tactics can pull you out of that space. Because you're no longer navigating your life through fear, you're walking it with truth. When manipulation no longer works, the person who once held control over you often shifts gears, not by walking away, but by reaching for something far more covert and corrosive: emotional sabotage. Unlike manipulation, which seeks to steer your behavior through guilt, charm, or passive pressure, emotional sabotage aims to unravel you from the inside. It's not about asking you to do something. It's about trying to make you doubt who you are, what you know, and whether you're even capable of standing strong on your own. Emotional sabotage often begins subtly. It looks like people withdrawing affection or support when you start asserting yourself. It looks like small, seemingly harmless comments that chip away at your confidence. Are you sure you're not overreacting? That seems kind of selfish. I just don't recognize you anymore. These phrases are rarely screamed. They're whispered just loud enough to be heard by the part of you that still wants to be accepted, because emotional sabotage doesn't rely on confrontation. It relies on confusion. It aims to destabilize, not destroy, because that instability creates just enough doubt for you to lower your guard again. What makes emotional sabotage especially dangerous is how quickly it can be mistaken for concern or even love. When someone says, "I'm just worried about you," but only after you've made an empowering decision they didn't like, it's easy to question whether your growth is actually a misstep. When they frame your boundaries as walls or your confidence as arrogance, you start to feel isolated, like you're somehow at fault for standing up. This is how sabotage sneaks in. It dresses up as emotional feedback, but its intention isn't to connect. It's to correct you back into the version of yourself they found easier to manage. This tactic often escalates when you're in the process of healing or transforming. When you've started therapy, begun pursuing your passions, left an unhealthy relationship, or simply started saying no. More often, people who once had influence over your decisions may begin to fear what your change means for their role in your life. Instead of adjusting to meet the new you, they attack the foundation of that new self. "You've changed" isn't always said with admiration. Sometimes it's used like an accusation, as though growth itself is betrayal. What emotional sabotage counts on is your history with the person. If they've been close to you, family, a longtime friend, a partner, they know where your soft spots are. They know how to frame their sabotage so it sounds familiar and hard to challenge. They may say things like, "You used to be so much more easygoing," or "I miss the old you," making it feel like you owe them the version of yourself that kept the peace at your expense. They're not looking for dialogue, they're looking for dominance, and when they can't get it through direct manipulation, they reach for your emotional foundation. One of the hardest things about this shift from manipulation to sabotage is that it often comes at a time when you're already in the vulnerable process of change. Growth by nature is uncomfortable. It often involves shedding identities, patterns, and roles that once felt like safety. When someone starts sabotaging you in the middle of that process, it can make you second guess whether your discomfort is the result of necessary growth or a sign that you're making a mistake. That confusion is exactly what they hope for, because when you're unsure of yourself, you're more likely to return to what's familiar, even if it's unhealthy. The pain of emotional sabotage is compounded by the betrayal it involves. These aren't strangers. These are often people you once trusted or still care about, which means confronting the sabotage doesn't just require courage. It requires grieving the loss of how you hoped the relationship could be, grieving the version of you that tolerated mistreatment for the sake of connection, and grieving the truth that some people would rather hurt you than see you outgrow them. Recognizing sabotage for what it is takes deep self-awareness. It requires noticing the patterns, not just in their behavior, but in how you feel around them. Do you feel smaller after you talk to them? Do you find yourself walking on eggshells again? Do their words make you question things you were certain of just days before? Those are signs, not of your weakness, but of their discomfort with your strength. And sometimes the most radical act of self-trust is believing your discomfort is the truth knocking on the door. Vulnerability is one of the most powerful things we can offer in a relationship, conversation, or connection. It is the courageous act of letting people see us, not the version we polish up for approval, but the real, raw self underneath. When we choose vulnerability, we're saying, "I'm willing to be seen. I'm willing to take the risk that you might not understand me, might not agree with me, and might even reject me. But I'm showing up anyway." It is the birthplace of intimacy, trust, and authenticity. But not everyone knows what to do with that kind of honesty, and worse, some people weaponize it. When someone can't manipulate you through surface-level tactics, and you begin to lead with authenticity, their next move is often to take what you've shared in vulnerability and use it against you. Not always openly, and not always immediately, but in ways that slowly disassemble your sense of emotional safety. They take the tender truths you've entrusted to them, the fears, the failures, the hopes, and repurpose them to make you question your strength, your decisions, or your right to take up space. Maybe you told them you struggled with not feeling good enough in past relationships. Later, when you assert a boundary, they might say, "You're just being insecure again, like you always are." Maybe you once opened up about how much you care about being seen as kind, only to have them turn around and say, "If you really cared about people, you wouldn't be acting this way." What's happening here is not just a breach of trust, it's an emotional ambush. You shared your truth not as a weakness, but as a doorway to deeper connection. They took that doorway and turned it into an exit route, one where they can leave you exposed and uncertain without ever having to take responsibility for their own behavior. This tactic is particularly cruel because it distorts what was meant to be sacred. Vulnerability is not confession. It's not something you're supposed to be punished for. It's a sign of deep emotional intelligence and bravery. But for someone who feels threatened by your autonomy or your clarity, it becomes ammunition. They know they can't manipulate you through guilt or control, so instead they try to bring you back into emotional dependence by undermining the very tools that made you strong. The open-hearted conversations, the moments of truth, the tears you didn't hide, the dreams you dared to speak out loud, all of that becomes fair game in their attempt to regain power. What makes this even more disorienting is how quickly it can make you turn on yourself. You start to question whether you shared too much, whether you should have kept that part of yourself hidden, whether your vulnerability gave someone the roadmap to your undoing. But the problem isn't that you were too open, it's that they were too afraid of what your openness revealed, that you're not someone they can manipulate anymore. Vulnerability exposes both people. And while you showed up, they shrank back into defense, turning the mirror on you instead of facing their own discomfort. When someone weaponizes your vulnerability, it can lead to shame. Not the healthy kind of shame that signals we've stepped out of alignment with our values, but the toxic kind, the one that makes us feel defective, too much, or not enough. Shame thrives in secrecy, and this tactic works best when you isolate yourself and silence your truth. That's why it's essential, when you sense this happening, to reconnect with your own voice and the people who hold your vulnerability with respect. Because vulnerability doesn't make you weak. It makes you powerful in a way manipulation never could. And it reminds the world and yourself that your story is not something to be turned against you, but something that belongs wholly to you. The people who weaponize vulnerability often do so because they haven't made peace with their own. Your courage unsettles them. Your honesty reminds them of what they've buried. Your growth highlights their stagnation, and instead of doing the work to meet you there, they reach for control. Not because you're wrong, but because your presence demands a level of emotional depth they're not ready or willing to explore. When someone realizes they can't manipulate you, their instinct isn't always to back off gracefully. In many cases, they don't want to lose their influence, but since they can no longer steer your choices through subtle pressure or emotional games, they pivot to something more destructive. They try to discredit you. This tactic doesn't require direct confrontation or honesty. It operates behind closed doors in the background through questions that sound like concern but are rooted in control. I just don't know if she's thinking clearly these days. He's been acting different lately. I'm not sure you can really trust what she says anymore. These aren't accusations, they're suggestions, and suggestions are often more powerful than outright lies because they plant doubt without being easy to challenge. Discrediting someone is about shifting the focus from their ideas or choices to their character. If a person can't make you act differently, they'll work to ensure others stop listening to you. They stop debating your perspective and start questioning your judgment. This can happen quietly, in whispers, or more publicly, through undermining your voice in group settings. It can even show up in subtle digs masked as jokes, the kind that make everyone laugh while something true about you is being stripped away. It's not always loud, but it's intentional. What's especially harmful about this tactic is how personal it becomes. Discrediting isn't just about disagreeing. It's about reshaping how others see you so that your words carry less weight. Your boundaries seem unreasonable, and your presence feels less trustworthy. It's the emotional equivalent of erasing someone while they're still in the room. And it's deeply isolating. Because while manipulation depends on controlling your choices, discrediting you is about shaping the way others view those choices so you lose support, respect, or influence. This tactic also preys on one of our most vulnerable human needs, the need to be believed. We want to know that when we speak our truth, others won't immediately assume the worst, that our actions will be interpreted in good faith. So when someone starts to quietly poison that well, it does more than hurt. It destabilizes our place in relationships and communities. You find yourself suddenly having to explain things that used to be understood. You feel the shift in how people respond to you, the slight hesitation, the subtle doubt, and the worst part, you can't always prove it's happening. The person doing this often avoids being overt. They rarely say anything that can be easily traced back or directly confronted. They operate in nuance, in tone, in the way they phrase things so it sounds like they're just being honest or concerned. But it's not honesty, it's erosion. They are eroding your credibility in order to rebuild their sense of control. Because if people stop trusting your perspective, they'll be more likely to align with the manipulator's version of reality, and once again, they are in the driver's seat. Another layer to this is projection. People who discredit others often do so because they fear being discredited themselves. They assume others will do what they would do if the roles were reversed. So, instead of dealing with their own discomfort, they go on offense. They assume strength must be arrogance, that change must mean betrayal, that clarity must mean superiority, and rather than sitting with their own feelings, they put them on you and then paint you as the problem. In situations like this, it's tempting to over-explain, to try to convince everyone you're still good, still trustworthy, still the same person, but that path often leads to exhaustion. You don't have to perform your integrity for people who have already decided to see you through someone else's distorted lens. The truth is, people committed to misunderstanding you won't be swayed by your efforts to prove them wrong. And those who know you really know you won't need the proof. Your consistency will speak louder than any campaign to discredit you. When people can't control you, they often try to control the narrative about you. That's not a reflection of who you are. It's a reflection of how threatened they feel by your strength. Because your refusal to be manipulated reveals something they'd rather not confront, that their influence is not owed, and their version of reality is not the only one. And when they can't make you smaller, they try to make your voice quieter by making others doubt what you say. Gaslighting is one of the most insidious tools used when manipulation no longer works. It's not loud, it's not always obvious, and that's what makes it so powerful. When someone gaslights you, they don't try to change your actions directly. They try to change your perception of reality. It's not about telling you what to do. It's about making you question your own thoughts, feelings, and memories so deeply that you start to wonder whether you can trust yourself at all. And when you begin to doubt your own reality, you become easier to control, not because someone overpowered you, but because they made you quietly surrender your inner compass. Gaslighting often begins subtly. It doesn't start with, "You're wrong." It starts with, "That's not what happened," or "You're being too sensitive," or "You always take things the wrong way." These statements are carefully framed to sound reasonable, even helpful, but their real purpose is to override your lived experience. You might walk away from a conversation feeling upset, but instead of that emotion being met with curiosity or compassion, it's dismissed as irrational or exaggerated. Over time, this wears you down. You start to internalize the idea that your feelings aren't valid, that your memory is unreliable, and that your reactions are somehow flawed. The most dangerous part of gaslighting is how it creeps in through familiarity. It often comes from people who know you well, partners, friends, family members, or leaders you once trusted. Because they've had a close seat to your vulnerabilities, they know how to twist reality just enough to make you feel off balance. They don't need to argue with the facts. They only need to make you feel unsure of your ability to interpret them. Suddenly, you're apologizing for things you didn't do, trying to defend reactions that were completely reasonable, or staying silent because it feels safer than speaking up and being told once again that you're wrong. Gaslighting works because it isolates you not just from others, but from yourself. You stop trusting your gut. You second guess your instincts. You replay conversations in your head, wondering if you really were out of line. It creates a fog, and in that fog, the person doing the gaslighting remains in control. They get to frame the narrative. They decide what's true and what's not. And you're left trying to navigate a landscape where nothing feels certain, not even your own emotions. What makes this tactic particularly damaging is that it often masquerades as reason. The person gaslighting you may sound calm, composed, and logical, while you feel increasingly emotional, frustrated, and defensive. That contrast can be used against you. Look at how you're reacting. They'll say, "You're always so emotional." And suddenly, your justified frustration becomes the focus, not their behavior. It's a masterful form of deflection. Instead of addressing what's actually happening, they get you to defend your tone, your delivery, your character, and in doing so, they steer the conversation away from accountability and back toward control. Another layer to gaslighting is the inconsistency. Sometimes the same person who tells you you're overreacting will turn around and praise your sensitivity when it benefits them. This inconsistency keeps you hoping that maybe, if you just say things the right way or control your emotions better, you'll be heard. That hope keeps you engaged in the cycle, but gaslighting isn't about communication. It's about power. And as long as they can make you question yourself, they never have to look at themselves. Breaking free from gaslighting requires more than just identifying it. It requires a reclaiming of your voice, your memory, and your emotional truth. That begins with noticing patterns. When someone repeatedly makes you feel confused, small, or unstable after you've tried to express a boundary or a hurt, that's not just a communication problem. That's an intentional strategy to regain control by weakening your confidence in your own perspective. You're not too sensitive. You're not making it up. You're not misunderstanding. If you feel like something is wrong, it probably is. If you feel like someone is trying to rewrite the truth, they probably are. And if you feel like your clarity is being threatened, that's a sign not that you're broken, but that someone else is uncomfortable with your strength. Because people who can't manipulate you don't always walk away. Sometimes they stay and try to turn your mind against itself. And the most radical act you can commit in response is to believe yourself anyway. When all other forms of control begin to fail, when someone can no longer manipulate you, gaslight you, discredit you, or twist your vulnerability, what they often turn to next is isolation. Not in the physical sense necessarily, though sometimes that's part of it. This isolation is more psychological, emotional, and social. It's a quiet effort to cut you off from your sources of strength, your relationships, your community, your clarity, and ultimately, your sense of self. Because when someone can't reach you directly, they'll try to shrink the world around you until you have nowhere else to turn but back toward them. The first move toward this kind of isolation is often disguised as concern. They might say things like, "I just don't think that friend has your best interests at heart," or "You've been spending a lot of time with them lately, and it's starting to change you." At face value, it sounds like care. But the motive underneath is not about your well-being. It's about narrowing the circle of people who affirm the stronger, freer version of you that's beginning to emerge. If they can sever those connections or cast suspicion on them, they make it easier for you to return to dependency, to confusion, to their version of truth. The tactics used for isolation are rarely overt at first. They're often small, strategic suggestions that certain people are a bad influence or that they don't understand you like this person does. You'll hear them frame others as jealous, toxic, or unreliable. Sometimes they'll create drama where there is none, pushing wedges between you and people who once supported you. They want you to believe you're safer with fewer people around, especially if those people challenge the control they used to have over you. One of the most disorienting things about this kind of isolation is how it makes you question your instincts. You begin to wonder if maybe you have outgrown certain relationships, or if maybe that friend really doesn't get what you're going through. And while growth can naturally shift your social circles, isolation by design feels different. It doesn't come with peace or alignment. It comes with pressure, guilt, and often subtle punishment for spending time with people who affirm you. The person pulling you into isolation won't usually say, "Don't hang out with them." Instead, they might withdraw emotionally after you do, or they'll act distant until you ask what's wrong. Then they'll say something vague that leaves you guessing, and once again, the emotional labor falls on you. This kind of control thrives on silence. They don't want you to process things with others because that opens the door to perspective. They'd rather keep your mind spinning in a loop of self, doubt where they can feed you half-truths unchecked. The fewer voices you hear, the more power theirs carries. And if you start to reconnect with yourself or others, they may escalate the tactics, playing the victim, accusing you of abandoning them, or suggesting that you've become cold, selfish, or unreachable. It's not just about cutting you off from people. It's also about cutting you off from yourself. They want to isolate you from your own wisdom, your own peace, your own emotional clarity. If they can get you to believe you're lost without them, they never have to confront the reality that they lost you because you found yourself. Sometimes this isolation happens in obvious relationships, romantic partners, controlling family members, even possessive friends. But it can also show up in workplaces, communities, or any dynamic where someone once held power and now feels it slipping away. The context doesn't matter as much as the pattern. The moment you start building a life rooted in your own voice, someone who benefited from your silence may begin trying to shrink your world. They do this not because you've harmed them, but because your freedom is inconvenient. It confronts them with the truth that you're not theirs to manage, shape, or contain. That truth can be unbearable for someone who built their self-worth on being needed, feared, or followed. So they attempt to isolate you not always with walls, but with emotional barriers, with mistrust, with manipulation disguised as love. It's not weakness to need people. It's not naive to crave connection. But when connection becomes a weapon someone uses to limit you rather than lift you, it's not a relationship. It's a tactic. And when you see it for what it is, you can begin to reclaim the space around you, the relationships that breathe life into you, and the truth that you were never meant to walk this road alone, or in someone else's shadow. So here we are standing in the clarity that comes after the fog. We've talked about the shift that happens when manipulation no longer works, and the ugly, quiet tactics people often turn to when they realize they can't control you anymore. They twist your vulnerability. They try to discredit your voice. They gaslight your truth. They isolate your support, not because you've changed for the worse, but because you've dared to change for the better. Your growth threatened their grip. Your boundaries challenged their entitlement. Your voice disrupted their comfort. But let this be your reminder: their reaction is not your responsibility. Their discomfort is not your burden to carry. You do not have to shrink to stay safe or stay silent to keep the peace. The fact that someone is trying to distort your reality is proof that your truth matters. The fact that they need a dirty trick to try to get close again means they've already lost access to the real you. So keep standing tall in your clarity. Keep choosing your peace over their chaos. Let them watch you rise without explanation, without apology, and without fear. Because when they can't manipulate you anymore, that's when your real power begins.